I'd like to invite Rear Admiral Peter Quinn, Head of Navy Capability, to introduce the session. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tish. What a fantastic sea power this has been, and a brilliant Pacific 19. Although I have to say the speed dating with the industry and our colleagues is pretty full on, and I've still got a bit more to go. But good afternoon. As Tish has said, I'm Rear Admiral Pete Quinn. I'm the Head of Navy Capability. So my role is to plan and deliver future systems for our Navy, and in particular delivering that lethal new capability that we need in a very agile way. So I ensure that Navy's capabilities meet our current requirements, and they evolve as threats and technology evolve to achieve the right level of joint integration effect that we need with the rest of the Australian Defence Force and with our close allies and partners. The aim is to continuously deliver and sustain lethal and agile naval capabilities. So change is something that is very relevant to my role. Changes in technology, the geostrategic and operating environment, changes to the range of potential roles and missions that the ADF may be required to undertake, and more broadly, changes to things like the attitudes of Australians to military service that might impact on the future demographic from which Navy will recruit from. So a very broad remit looking at all of the fundamental inputs to capability. So I think it's fitting that I'm the moderator for this session on continuity or change, cutting through the noise. Change refers to something that is obviously different to what occurred previously, and continuity refers to things that stay the same, relatively unchanged over time. Not all things change over time, and some things remain the same across long periods of time, even into this seemingly always changing modern world. Our Minister for Defence, Linda Reynolds, said yesterday that Australia and the region was seeing the most significant geopolitical changes since World War II. But amongst these many changes, as the Fleet Commander said, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And we heard from the panel session yesterday and from the Chief and from the Fleet Commander, we heard that constants like the things that we seek in Australia, things like free trade, open sea lanes and stability, they're the things that don't change. For Australia, these things will remain at the core of our maritime interest. So these two factors of significant geostrategic changes but steadfast core maritime security interests shapes my task in planning and delivering Navy's future maritime systems. The other thing that shapes my thinking is technology. Technology is undoubtedly reshaping our modern lives and is progressively changing the way we will fight in the future. But to this point, warfighting has remained essentially a human endeavour. But will this change? Will the advent of advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, cyber and space warfare fundamentally change the nature of future competition? Will we soon see a disruptive turning point in the way that we plan to fight? Perhaps in the same way that technologies like the internet, social media and smart devices are fundamentally reshaping the way humans organise themselves and interact with each other, sometimes leading to significant disruptive change. Or is there more continuity than not that should be guiding our thinking about what's to come and my planning for the future of our Navy? To explore this key topic of continuity or change, it gives me great pleasure to introduce three fantastic speakers for this afternoon's panel. Firstly, Dr. Euan Graham, the Executive Director of Trobe Asia. Euan has been a close observer of Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian security affairs for more than 20 years in academia, the private sector and for the British government. He joined the Lowy Institute in 2015 from the S. Rajapatman School of International Studies in Singapore, where he specialised in maritime security. Prior to this, he was a research analyst in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Service, and must have had a fascinating posting as to the British Embassy in Pyongyang. Euan's most recent experience in the maritime domain was at sea on board HMAS Canberra during the Indo-Pacific Endeavour deployment earlier this year. Secondly, Mr Nick Charles, the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Nick has worked at the BBC for more than 3 decades, most recently as World Affairs Correspondent, but also as their Defence and Pentagon Correspondent. Mr Charles is responsible for the Institute's analysis of naval forces and maritime security and for the data on sea power capabilities published in the flagship annual military balance. And finally, Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande, Admiral Shri, who is retired from the Indian Navy. Admiral Shri had an illustrious career commanding the Indian ships Nishank, Kora and the guided missile destroyer Rajput. A 1995 graduate of the Indian Staff Course, he won the Scudder Medal. He completed his higher naval command course in Mumbai in 2002 and then went straight on to the US War College in Naval War College in 2003, where he graduated with the highest distinction and won the Robert Bateman and Jerome E. Levy Individual Prizes and James Forrestal Seminar Prize. He is currently reading for his PhD at Mumbai University. And importantly, he was the Defence Attaché here for India in Canberra from 2004 to 2006. So without further ado, I'll invite the panellists to deliver about 12 minutes or so of opening remarks, starting with Dr. Graham. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Admiral Quinn, and to the Sea Power Centre for inviting me back to this conference. I was last here 2 years ago, and first in 2013. It's always a pleasure to be here, and indeed back in Sydney. So I latched onto the second part of the formulation of this session, the cutting through the noise, and I was scratching my head for something that would fit the bill. And it didn't take me very long to think about the US Marine Corps Commandant's new planning and guidance, because I think for a public military document, it really does fit that description in terms of its radical assessment of change. There is continuity present too, but I think change is the key thing. And I think it's significant not just in its own right that it's the United States Marine Corps and an ally of Australia that is going through this period of change and reassessment, but I think there are broader lessons that are directly and indirectly applicable to the US allies, including Australia. So General Berger, who is the 38th Commandant of the US Marine Corps, wants to restore the Corps to a sea power role as a naval expeditionary force. This is reasserted several times during the planning and guidance. And just to stress, this is a public document. Many of you may be aware of it or have read it, but I would commend it to you for those who haven't. It is largely couched in terms of operating forward within adversaries' weapons engagement zone, providing sea denial and localized sea control, actively in support of the US Navy and US allies. As such, it's a significant shift away from the USMC's post-Cold War and post-9/11 roles, where it operated much more, I think, as an adjunct of the US Army, in Berger's own words, fixated on infantry and ground maneuver, and represents a return to its expeditionary roots. I think its significance lies in its honesty and its candor about the nature of the strategic problems that the US faces against peer adversaries. And their denial capabilities, especially long-range missiles, can in Berger's assessment, no longer make it much more difficult for the United States Marine Corps to undertake its traditional approach to power projection. Not that it can't be done, but it's significantly harder. I think there's also clarity in the planning and guidance about the nature of the solution, clarity on ends, ways, and means, even if those means are potentially declining. That's another, I think, significant point there. Berger talks about a possible reduction in total resources. He doesn't shy away from taking on sacred cows in force design and operating concepts. In fact, the Commandant's planning and guidance embraces strategic iconoclasm. And he says, we must divest of legacy capabilities. And in another phrase, what served us well yesterday may not today. In fact, Berger has already done away with the long-held 38-ship requirement for the amphibious force. But it's less about scrapping, in my view, and more about repurposing the USMC in service of a more realistic maritime strategy. It ushers in a fundamental and radical change in thinking. I think that's the key thing about US strategy for a tougher era against a thinking enemy. And I think what lies behind that is that this is sweeping aside a prolonged era in which the US has grown very used to operating within so-called permissive environments. So that era is now firmly over, and the planning and guidance has called time on it. Berger doesn't mince his words, but I think it's also significant that the guidance does carry a positive message for restoring the US to a sustainable forward-deployed deterrence posture. It calls for the USMC to harness the same technologies that have enabled US adversaries to field those long-range precision fires and to apply them in reverse, turning the strategic tables, in other words. A key enabler to this counter-denial strategy, if we can call it that, relies on harnessing strategic maritime geography. That's another core part of it. And Berger says we must possess the ability to turn maritime spaces into barriers so that we can attack an adversary's sea line of communication while defending our own in support of the fleet or the joint force. Now, the planning and guidance is global in scope, but I think unmistakably it also identifies the Pacific as the USMC's priority theatre, and Berger's emphasis on leveraging strategic maritime terrain makes most obvious sense in the context of the first and second island chains. It also has implications that extend beyond the USMC to other US services. Most obviously, the United States Navy is the service that Berger aims primarily to reintegrate with. But the planning and guidance is broad enough in scope that its implications for deterrence and for US forward posture run across all domains. Berger's guidance recognizes that the USMC also has to retool its combat capabilities to support this high-end naval fight, which will be largely missile-based. And there is a significant emphasis on unmanned platforms, just echoing Admiral Quinn's opening comments. The planning and guidance also grapples with deterrence below the threshold of combat operations, addressing the tricky problem for the United States of how to respond to hybrid warfare tactics in the South China Sea and elsewhere. FONOPs have had their place in lawfare, but they have fallen far short as a counter-strategy to China's chiseling away at the status quo. Those are my words, but I think that's the implication that also runs through it. There is also a calling out of over-reliance on exquisite capabilities, not enough risk-worthiness, and greater need for, and I quote, many smaller, low-signature, affordable platforms. The planning and guidance doesn't have much in detail to say about US allies, and that's perhaps an area for further development as it beds in, but it is directly and indirectly relevant to them. And I think that above point about the exquisite capability rings true, in my view, of Australia's high capability, low capacity ADF. Pacific allies share similar geostrategic problems and opportunities to the United States forward deployed. Berger's emphasis on strengthened integration between ground forces and navies in support of a maritime expeditionary strategy should also resonate with Australia and Japan as they develop their own amphibious forces. And that word expeditionary, again, is hit like a gong throughout the planning and guidance. There are some other points that also cut through, I think, from the document. It's not only about the strategic landscape. I think there are also very significant imaginative and progressive approaches to personnel issues, including how to retain talent within the service, and non-linear career progression policies on racism, sexual assault, and a variety of other topics that all professional militaries have to wrestle with. And I think it puts forward an enlightened approach on military education, recognizing that the United States Marine Corps and the US Navy personnel have to educate each other. It has, in summary, the radical feel of what I would call an expeditionary counterinsurgency strategy, if such a thing is possible. There's almost the feeling of the US projecting itself in the role of the underdog. And in that sense, I think one of the most powerful things about the planning and guidance is that it does feel that it's recasting US power positively, but in a post-primacy role. There are, however, I think, questions still around its ability to cut through other parts of the US system. After all, the US Marine Corps is just one armed service. It has to do the job of persuasion to the other armed services. I think the US Navy would be the easier part of that. And then beyond that, of course, there is the issue of how to fund the transformation of the USMC. But I don't think it's something that would absorb too much resources. It comes down to my final point. It really is an adjustment, a fundamental adjustment in thinking, because until the thinking really adjusts and the mindset moves on, it's pointless to talk about technological or capability, force structure, operating concepts changing. First of all, you have to change your mindset. With that, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. I'd now like to invite Mr. Nick Childs. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Quinn. I'm very honoured to be here. I'm very pleased to be invited to this rather extraordinary event, and it's certainly been an eye-opener for me because it's very much my first time here. Indeed, it's my first time on Australian soil, in spite of my current role as a naval forces specialist with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and that does cover the waterfront, supposedly, in my previous incarnation that was hinted at as a former international correspondent for the BBC. It's, for me, a long overdue ticking of the personal box, the fact that this is my first time here in Australia at all. The session title is Continuity or Change, but as already been hinted at, it is actually both. It's continuity and change. And the trick is working out what to hold on to, what is staying the same, and what you need to do differently, what has changed. And at a tactical and operational and managerial level, though the answers to those questions will be different depending on which Navy you are talking about. The big, long wave trends are one thing. The more granular questions depend on where a particular navy is positioned at any one time and what its ambitions are, where it is in a particular acquisition cycle as well, and other things. But of course, the answers are informed by those larger, long wave issues, those bigger issues as well. At the parallel King Hall History Conference that I addressed yesterday, Professor Geoffrey Hill offered the cautionary injunction that Professor Geoffrey Till, I beg his pardon, offered the cautionary injunction not to try to learn too much from history. from what is a different world than today, and that is right. But he also pointed out that there are those things that endure. In 1947, the revered US Admiral Raymond Spruance was invited to give his thoughts in a speech at the then US National War College, now the US National Defense University, on the future role of naval forces, reflecting on his recent experiences and the lessons of the Second World War, but also at the dawn of the atomic age, a period of great change, upheaval even. While acknowledging a great period of technological and technical change, he also remarked that for as long as the surface of the sea remains the great highway connecting the nations of the world, the role of a navy, of a major navy at least, like the United States, would be to gain and exercise control of the sea and prevent opponents from using it for their purposes. And that is a continuity, that is a continuum. We remain in a world of increasing global interdependence, despite the noise that 3D printing is sounding the death knell, for example, of trade, the end of globalization, and the noise of trade wars. Globalization is a tarnished brand for many at the moment. The challenge is that the growing interdependence that there is being accompanied by increasing populism and the weakening of international structures. There is also a danger that the mantra of upholding the rules-based international order ends up sounding like defense of the status quo, the wrong kind of continuity. It's actually about adaptation and change itself, based on consensus and common values. And it puts an increased premium on new frameworks for cooperation and partnership. Another part of the challenge to the continuum, the change bit, is that a major element of the flux in the global order is the uncertainty of the trajectory of all the big geostrategic players. It's not just about the geostrategic arrival of China. One consequence of that is it is shining a spotlight on and putting increased burdens and responsibilities on those powers of a certain scale, in other words, of the medium powers, those who have, in some ways, for so long hidden behind the overarching capabilities of the big powers and have discounted their own roles a little bit. And for the most part, they know who they are. That is a change, how they respond and how they take up that baton, including particularly in the maritime space, with each other and with the big boys, will be crucial in deciding whether or not the current age of uncertainty risks turning into an age of raging uncertainty, with recent events in and around the Strait of Hormuz perhaps sounding an alarm bell on that. A critical part of this equation is for those medium-sized powers to work out realistically what their level of ambition can be, where and with whom, in what collaborative constructs, and that's clearly a question posed here as well. Going back to the Great Highway idea, one big change, of course, is that it has shifted from a recent post-Cold War past of being a benign superhighway for the projection of power and for so-called wars of choice. The well-used refrain now is of contested, congested, and complex domains. But what does that really mean? And is part of the noise the debates that have raged over what we call A2AD, anti-access area denial? Does the scale of the challenge and the state of technological development now that we've been talking about mean we are seeing a game-changing shift in the capability development between control or denial? Or have we talked ourselves into a mindset of anti-access self-denial, where the range circles of weapons we draw on maps now have been transformed into no-go areas? And the response that we've heard and the analysis that we heard from Euan about the US Marine Corps Commandant's guidelines is an interesting case study of that response. Cutting through the noise of the debate over aircraft carriers may help as well. It is, again, to a large extent, noise. One of the issues you have is that on the one hand, you have the detractors who label These platforms are sitting ducks in the face of anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonics. And on the other, there are those, not least amongst the aviators in the US Navy, who see them still as the best defended and most survivable airfields in the world. Unlike when the day of the battleship was over, aircraft carriers do remain uniquely flexible strategic assets whose range capabilities and range of capabilities have not been replaced by any one system. But maybe there does need to be more honesty about how they need to adapt and how quickly. And they have shown they can uniquely adapt. And how their role in future fleet makeups will change and the effect that that will have on the application of naval power in the future. It's arguable whether the reappearance of a contested maritime domain is a change or a return to base course after a brief anomaly, but it is affecting change in terms of capability requirements, and of that there is no doubt. As symbols of that, I focus on the differing fortunes of two programs. One is the US littoral combat ship, now much unloved. In some ways, it was an honourable effort to cut through some of the acquisition sclerosis that we've all endured and experienced and observed. And that is absolutely a right impulse. There may be a lot of noise around innovation, but a key innovation bottleneck is in changing the acquisition question. It was an attempt to deliver a platform for forward presence, particularly in the littorals. It was perhaps also an object lesson in how you can get things wrong if you rush and don't do your homework on operational analysis properly. But its great misfortune was that the world changed and suddenly it looked as if it was not fit for purpose. Paradoxically, you have, and we're getting closer to home here, the UK Type 26 frigate design, the foundation of the new Hunter class. 10 years ago, it was being marketed as a global combat ship, and nobody was interested because it was a high-end, expensive platform, when the focus was on chasing Somali pirates. Now the world has come round to meet the Type 26, and the design has become a 32-ship class that will be the backbone of at least 3 Five Eyes navies. But change continues. It's a continuum as well. And the issues there are then how do you adapt to the possibility of changing strategic circumstances in the future? How do you further future-proof in terms of open architecture and the like going forward? An interesting further element of the discussion on that is that the UK has also just launched another lower-end frigate program, the Type 31, which has become a source of considerable debate because it is pitched at a different level of capability for different requirements, and some have disparaged it as a very large ship that's very lightly armed, the world's largest OPV. But in the context of the parameters requirements for the Royal Navy, you could argue it was absolutely the right choice because it is a large volume platform which can in future be spiral equipped with new capabilities. And what those new capabilities are, the short-term phrase is up-gunning, but it's actually up-capabilitying that we're talking about. And being a mothership and a home for future systems is key to the future. But there's the rub. There's a revival and a focus on high-end capabilities like anti-submarine warfare. But the non-state maritime security challenges haven't gone away. On the contrary, they're evolving and they're presenting new challenges. Another one of those continuums is the enduring and universal debate over quantity versus quality or capability. My contention is that the proliferation of precision and advanced capabilities among more and more states and non-state actors like the Houthi rebels with their sophisticated anti-ship missiles in Yemen is making those previously quite clear choices between operational requirements for high-end warfighting and lower-end maritime security contingencies ever more blurred, and it's making the judgments on the capabilities required for high-low first or second division capabilities much more challenging. And it trickles all the way down from the high end to the minimum capability requirements for even basic patrolling missions. In broad terms, the need for a balanced fleet may be a continuity, but it's necessary to rethink how to define that balance. And to do that, it will also be necessary to cut through the noise of innovation and emerging technologies. It's impossible not to understand that this will be transformational. We've heard already today about the pace and indeed the increasing pace of change. Things have never changed so fast as they have in the past 2 years, but they will never change so slowly again. And to do that, we also must necessarily cut through the noise of innovation and emerging technologies and understand, absolutely embrace them, but understand that it's also necessary to be clear-eyed on what they can and can't deliver. The US, the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, is a think tank that is founded on production of data and data analysis. One of my boss's favorite factoids is the recent output of Chinese shipyards, and the response is always, we cannot respond in this way. Technology provides and will provide the answer, the solutions in the future. But it is necessary to understand also that it's not a panacea. Equally, choices need to be made. 3 years ago, and here's another potential guideline that's out there. 3 years ago, the US Navy's answer to the China challenge was 355. That was the force level requirement, the battle force requirement for the then force structure assessment. We're now going through a new phase of capability assessment in the US Navy. A new force structure assessment is coming out, and I doubt if the number will be 355 next time. The question will be what the balance of the fleet looks like with that, whether there are sacred cows there that are going to be offered up, and where both platforms of a manned and unmanned nature fit into the bill. One final point I'll just make, and I know my time is up, but I just want to raise the point that we talk about cutting through the noise, but one issue we must deal with is noise is not necessarily something you should dismiss out of hand as a bad thing. Debate is good. And some noise is good. It wasn't so long ago that people were anguishing over sea blindness, the silent services, and a post-naval era, in the West at least. And in an attention deficit show-me world in which navies face structural challenges, noise can actually grab attention. There may be a lot of noise around perceived failures in the maritime response in the Strait of Hormuz at the moment. But it's also fundamentally, I think, good for the maritime case that it is grabbing people's attention and answering the so what question that many in the public ask when they're confronted by the naval advocates with all those statistics about global maritime trade. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Childs. Now I'd like to invite Rear Admiral Shrikhande. Thank you, sir. Need some extra space at all?
It should be all right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special privilege for me to be on stage today. I've been part of the audience at 2 CPAR conferences in 2006 and 2008, both very invigorating while escorting the Indian Navy's senior leadership when I was the defense advisor at the Indian High Commission in Canberra. I must thank the Royal Australian Navy and the CPAR Centre for the opportunity to make the transition from the rows at the back to the podium. I am especially happy to see more than a few old friends from the Royal Australian Navy and the ADF as a whole, some of whom I've kept in touch with in the past few years, and that some of the members of the so-called 4C Club I was part of in Canberra are today in several leadership positions across Australia. In the dozen years that it has taken me to make this transition, we are in the age of the Indo-Pacific once again. We often talk about the Quad. We have gravitated towards terms like rules-based order and freedom of the Indo-Pacific. But before I begin, let me add a disclaimer. The thoughts I present today are my own and not that of any government or private agency in India. And therefore, under this theme, my title is really Make a Signal, moving from a ballet to a more robust haka in the Indo-Pacific. In a sense, there is not much that is new in the key idea of the Indo-Pacific as a domain in which for more than a millennium, some states have tried to improve their chances of calling the shots and others who have been concerned about the consequences that they face or might face. There was a time when ancient India seemed like an Indo-Pacific power, expanding its influence westward. Later, China made some half-hearted attempts through Jenga's 15th century expeditions. Then came the Vasco da Gama epoch, and soon enough, the Spanish, Dutch, French, and the British came in through the Atlantic, ultimately followed by a latecomer Imperial Germany. In the other direction, the Americans came to be at the western edge of the Pacific after their victory in the US-Spanish War. However, they did not move into the Indian Ocean until well after the Second World War. The Imperial Japanese developed a keenness to be part of the Indo-Pacific and leveraged the opportunities the First World War provided. And they did so with some astute cooperation with partners like Britain and her dominions. Thereafter, the ambition of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere germinated slowly but surely. Haushofer's 1920s coinage of the term Indo-Pacific and an Indian maritime strategist Panikar's references to it before the Second World War remain, I think, fairly contextual even today, although the details are different. But what is actually happening? Consider the Indo-Pacific. There is just so much discussion on the idea of the Indo-Pacific at various levels, including among leaders of governments across the globe. It means different things to different nations, as Dr. David Brewster said this morning, in terms of geographic and geostrategic contours. Even those countries that do not like the term, like China, recognize the importance of the Indo-Pacific as a current and future arena for competition and influence. Is there a central deep idea or driver behind the term Indo-Pacific that most states would like to believe or be more willing and openly identify with? It could be said that Asia-Pacific as a concept began with a geo-economic intent, driven by the growing prosperity of some ASEAN and East Asian members. It expanded due to the role that the United States played in the region, as well as the rise of China that further underscored the economic rising tide, which perhaps was lifting several boats. On the other hand, in its current iteration, the Indo-Pacific has gained traction with a central driver that nonetheless is not easily admitted to. It is the concerns that emerge out of the rise of China. And yet, constraints of statecraft of most Indo-Pacific, or for that matter, the Quad constituents, are such that there is difficulty in providing a more open focus. In the many ways that Indo-Pacific or the Quad or the inclusive Quad is talked about, we see the more politically correct issues coming to the foreground, while the actual geopolitical concerns are kept in the background. The problem with this is at least fourfold. First, it is difficult to give weight to the central idea of counterbalancing China and in giving meaning to aspects like urging China to adhere to a quote-unquote rules-based behavior and so on. Second, if issues like economic integration, HADR, fighting terrorism, voicing concerns about freedom of navigation, climate change, and so on remain center stage, then there are already several competing associations, agencies, and multilateral arrangements in which these are being addressed and possibly more effectively. Third, several countries talk about their own Indo-Pacific strategies. Necessarily, strategies of statecraft have to have combinations of ends, ways, and means and evaluate risk everywhere. Fundamentally, what would be the focus if it is not to be China? Finally, if Indo-Pacific or Quad Plus are to be inclusive, then are only those countries in the Indo-Pacific that have some concerns and anxieties with respect to China's actions and behavior to be included? Or could China itself be included if the objectives of the strategy are actually attainment of these essentially what I would call feel-good, do-good aspects? A few brief points about the Quad and inclusive Quad. It may be useful to remember that while the security and implied China focus was first discussed in 2007, the Quad informally came about after the December 2004 tsunami. It was meant to primarily help coordinate assistance to Indonesia, with Jakarta's own deep role in it. Yet, subsequently, talk of the Squad focused on the quartet of Australia, India, Japan, and the US, with the defining phrase of like-minded democracies. At least I think it is an inelegant phrase and perhaps inaccurate as well. What are the four countries like and unlike-minded about? Quite a bit of both likes and unlikes, as happens even amongst friends, exist. Further, Indonesia is a fulcrum Indo-Pacific nation, a vibrant democracy, growing economy, and has several points of friction with China. This is despite the reality that, just like almost everyone else in the Indo-Pacific and in the Quad, economic and diplomatic engagements with China are also significant. The recent transitions towards an inclusive Quad and the central role of the ASEAN is to be welcomed, of course. My view is that when all the feel-good and do-good clutter of the Quad is filtered out, the purpose of the Quad Plus would be to transition towards what I would like to say being a squad, where nations and their armed forces march somewhat in step. And this has to have coherence across the DIME framework in constraining and containing China's, what I would call, unfriendliness of purpose, which was a phrase used by George Kennan to describe some angles of communist Soviet Union's policies. This squad does not need to mimic NATO as a taut politico-military formulation bound by a treaty. But certainly the quartet needs to expand, and the term Quad itself perhaps needs to be put to rest. Two major ASEAN members, Indonesia that I mentioned and Vietnam, could contribute very credibly to the needed focus of an expanded and inclusive new avatar of the Quad. Let me suggest another thought. What about Russia? Despite their current convergences, there are older Sino-Russian animosities that may not go away, and the Chinese moves towards the Russian Far East, inroads into Central Asia, as well as a covetous eye on the Arctic, perhaps means that the relationships could sour. India and Japan's engagement with Russia are on the right lines, and others in the Indo-Pacific, including the US, perhaps need to look at Russia in the long term as part of the framework. Let me bring up a few maritime and naval issues that also need some cutting through the clutter and improve the signal-to-noise ratio. While it may be convenient to think of the Indo-Pacific as essentially a maritime construct, it may not be adequate to do so. The focus should be on land and the complex continental and terrestrial issues that include disputed islands as well as the urge to create territory at sea. Recall that NATO during the Cold War was far less about the Atlantic than it was about Europe, and yet maritime strategies still mattered. Yes, a maritime title like the Indo-Pacific is a more convenient term, yet even navies need to see beyond the oceanic framework to the continental as well. There is another important consideration. China has profitably laid the strands of continental and maritime statecraft in its DIME construct, in a manner which has not really been seen earlier. In its breathtaking scope and spread, the OBOR is only a manifestation of the way in which Mackinder and Spikeman, Mahan and Corbett, to name just four, have been leveraged in Beijing's geopolitics. Yet, while the OBOR may seem breathtaking now, it may leave China out of breath and its ambitions may unravel someday. But we could leave more on that for the Q&A. Chinese moves in the South China Sea have potentially serious future implications on the freedom of navigation and freedom of the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese transition from the 9-dash lines to arguments of the so-called four-sha framework of South China Sea claims needs to receive more legal, diplomatic, military, and naval attention. The four-sha essay refers to the Pratas Islands, which are called Dongsha by them, Paracels, which are Jisha, Macclesfield Bank, which are the Zhongsha, and the Spratlys, which of course are the Nansha. If other nations and navies choose to look the other way or play down the potential implications, then current Indo-Pacific discussions seem not much more than shadow boxing. I would like to argue some changes in approaches and finding answers. First, there is overinterpretation about the maritime nature of China's threat and of the maritime nature, therefore, of the responses. The maritime dimension is, of course, very important, but I would argue that overinterpreting is almost never useful. For several years, a few Indo-Pacific navies have been cooperating meaningfully, and the senior officers who spoke on behalf of their navies yesterday illustrated this well. It is, after all, easier for navies to cooperate than for armies and air forces. However, in a larger sense, the effectiveness of any military influence and leverage against China is going to be meaningful when multi-domain military effectiveness, that is air power, land power, cyber and space plus sea power, becomes the focus for cooperation. The Australian Chief of Navy underscored this yesterday. Nations and their maritime strategies would need to reduce the pirouetting and traipsing around the real issue, which I believe is China. Currently, the effort has been to essentially de-emphasize China as the problem and give greater visibility to the Indo-Pacific for freedom of the Indo-Pacific, HADR, freedom of navigation, etc. Among other things, this approach is seen in the statements coming out of exercises such as Malabar and Varuna to refer specifically to the ones that India participates in with the US, Japan, and France. FONOPs in the South China Sea ought to be undertaken by more navies, else the Chinese consolidation and future claims to sovereignty could get stronger, especially under the four-Shah framework. Couldn't statecraft be deployed to use the leverage and influence of sea power to make a signal instead of mixing up signals much of the time? One could use the meaning of Admiral Goldrick's advice, echoing 1006 and all that, on a naval failing of romanticizing the past as wrong but romantic. There seem to be gaps between figuring future strategic imperatives, and there are pundits who are not bad at it, and those who are currently responsible in their navies and armed forces for force planning. The latter need to be more inclined to be future-ready than emphasizing why the current zones of comfort would somehow work well in the future. May I suggest here that force structuring, unlike domestic politics, is raucous democracies, is not about the art of the possible, but of the art and science of what may work better and become necessary in decades ahead. It is about reducing future risks. And importantly, it is not about hardware, as somebody else had said, but people, ideas, and things. General Mick Ryan said, and I quote, people, ideas, and things in that order, as John Boyd said. I attended a session of the History Conference yesterday, which referred to the better French tanks and even aircraft in 1939 and 1940, but the absence of the effective doctrine, which the Wehrmacht did so much better with inferior hardware, but with better imagination, training, and doctrine. People and ideas have mattered more than things, and there is little reason to believe that it would not remain true for the future. Finally, diplomatic and military instruments need to make more robust signals, and therefore the analogy of the robust haka than an elegant ballet might just work better. I would end by suggesting that if nations and navies of the Indo-Pacific are bashful in making a signal and continue to cede the initiative to Beijing, then when it is time to make another signal, it could be from a further position of disadvantage. Perhaps we could avoid that trap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We've probably got a few minutes to take a couple of questions, and then we'll be handing over to the Chiefs panel. For Mr. Childs, are things really moving faster than ever before, or is it that there's just the parochialism of the present? Sorry.
When I was talking about ever faster pace of change, I think it was very much in the context of technological change, and I think that is a challenge, and it's a challenge particularly in the context of innovation and agility as far as trying to develop and acquire capabilities for naval forces and defence forces generally. And part of the further issue around innovation in particular is it's a mindset. It's not a destination. It's a continuing issue because and this was mentioned actually in the previous session as well, advantages, even if they are acquired, are going to be ever more transient. Part of the problem and part of the issue around decision making in the future is there are differential changes, and it's, you know, picking winners and understanding what the strategic changes are very difficult. 30 years ago, you had science fiction films set today that were, you know, anticipating everyone had lasers and, you know, bases on the moon, but completely failing to anticipate the information revolution that we've seen. So that's part of the problem.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question. Just bring that one up. Do navies need to shift back from a focus on power projection to sea control, or have these concepts now effectively merged? Sir, if you like.
I would suggest here that all the tasks remain important, and they are likely to remain important for a long time to come, which means power projection, sea control, and where applicable, sea denial. The instruments might change, the methods might change, the ranges and the flexibility with which you can do any of these will keep changing, and the threats to the countermeasures to these missions are also changing, and navies just need to be alive to that. You cannot hold on to concepts that because it worked 20 years ago, that's the way we will go. Those things change, but the essence, the principles of sea control, sea denial, power projection, and deterrence itself, I don't think are, the principles really don't change.
Thank you, sir. I'll now hand over to Admiral Quinn to close off. So, thanks, sir.
So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard three excellent presentations this afternoon. I took a lot from each of them. I think, Euan, I think your presentation of, I think, really the so what to the changes that are going on at the moment, looking at General Burge's US Marine Corps planning guidance was pretty spot on. I think there is a lot in that planning guidance that we can learn from. In particular, I think the notion of changing our mindset, thinking about what's changed and how we can influence that change. Not being afraid to move sacred cows to one side, but what I really like about the new Marine Corps strategy is its focus on land forces supporting sea power and the projection of sea power, and getting over our issues that some people have with thinking about getting into A2, AD areas. Nick, I like your question right at the start about the key issue being navies needing to understand what their ambitions are before they start thinking about their force. I think your discussion about thinking our way through which things endure and which things changing is really key, and that is really necessary for us to cut through to work out, well, what does a balanced fleet in the future actually look like? What things will remain constant or what things need to adapt? And I think really key point, some noise is very important. Debating these issues is going to be essential to work out the right way ahead. Admiral Shri, I think a great presentation on the age of the Indo-Pacific. I think being a clear-eyed naval officer, you'd like to cut directly to the chase and talking about that issue of really identifying as what we see to be the issues and talk about them clearly, particularly with our close friends and partners being key to doing this. It is obviously a difficult issue to talk very clearly about all the challenges we do because we all have things that we need to balance. And I think you made a great comment about it's not just maritime. To understand the maritime issues, you also need to understand the continental issues as we think about our strategies. So I think a key for me was really that point about the importance of spending the time to sort through what's enduring, what are our enduring capabilities, what are the enduring issues, and what are the things that are changing that we need to adapt our forces for, or perhaps change direction completely. With the key point being is that changing our mindsets about how we think about these things will be key. So thank you very much for some fascinating presentations and for spending the time with us, and if you could join me in thanking our panellists.